you'd mentioned like when do we decide what rep ranges to use? And, I had alluded to earlier just, the how heavy you can lift on a given movement. I mean, obviously some movements are going to allow you to progress in load at a much quicker rate than others. Um, and so that's kind of what drives it for me. Um, Isolation movements, I would say I rarely program them below like 8 reps. Not that they're not effective, but for the reasons that we mentioned already. It just doesn't seem necessary, and the downsides, the theoretical downsides don't outweigh like the practicality of just training a little bit lighter for those movements. Um, I think, the strength versus hypertrophy discussion is kind of worth having. Like, I think even with like a back squat, I might have, like, let's say a power lifter. I'll use a scenario like a power lifter in a hypertrophy block versus just a bodybuilder in a hypertrophy block. And let's say we're both using back squats in both those programs. I'd be more inclined to have, load increases on a more consistent basis in the power lifter and maybe let reps trend down, oftentimes I'll do like plus, add 5 to 10 pounds, cap it at an 8 RPE, on your top set or something. And so naturally the reps kind of trend down in a linear manner across the block, but load's going up. So they're getting some of those load specific adaptations without, while it's still, auto-regulated in nature. Whereas for a bodybuilder, it's less relevant there, which path you go. And I think from a, as you mentioned, just the differences in terms of injury rates, over time, I think you're probably better off progressing reps before load if you're a bodybuilder in most cases. It doesn't mean like just keep climbing reps until you're at 20 and then increase, but I like giving a range, like 6 to 10, 8 to 12, 12 to 15, climb up that range, increase the load and kind of rinse and repeat. And the difference between like, I try to keep the ranges close enough, the bottom and the top end, so they're in the same ballpark. But then for some movements, like, for example, like let's say we're using a double progression format for something like a lateral raise, and somebody's doing 20 pounds and say the rep range is 12 to 15. Well, if they get to 15 reps across the board and increase to 25 pounds, they might fall short of 12 reps on that next set. So I think some movements that are lighter in nature, I like to kind of widen the rep range a little bit at times where, maybe it's, 8 to 15 or something like that. That way, because I think psychologically, I've had people where, they've come back and they've said like, I increased load, but I can only do, 11 reps. And I'm like, well, it doesn't really matter. Like you're still good, So being able to give the athlete, the ability to feel like they reach the objective, by increasing those rep ranges a little bit, I think is helpful too.
Absolutely. And I to really kind of illustrate your point, if you think about it, like if you were to do a set of 6, and you were to ask yourself, all right, what would it take if I just took that set of 6 next week? How much strength would I have to gain to now make that my 7 RM? That's a like 15, 16% increase in strength by next week. However, if you're doing a set of 12 and you're now being asked to take that to the 13th rep, it's half that, right? And I think that's something that people don't consider is that especially for isolation movements where you've got a single muscle and you're moving very light loads, depending on the type of lever it is, you're using, like going from 20 to 25 pounds is a pretty big jump, that's a 25% increase in load. So if I did my math right, and I might have not, but you know what I'm saying.
20%.
20%, thank you. So it's a 20% increase in load you're asking yourself to do. And that's a lot. Like if you went from your 60% of 1RM on a squat to your 80%
it is
of 1RM on a squat.
I feel like an idiot now. 20 to 25 would be, 5 out of 20 is 25%.
Okay,
you were
cool.
right. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. That's why I got the PhD, because I can do math on the fly slightly better. So yeah, I mean, you're asking a lot to go from, say, 60% of 1RM to 85% of 1RM. That's the equivalent kind of load increase, but we don't think of it that way. We're like, oh, I did the 20s last week. The next thing in the rack is the 25s. And you're like, oh my God, that's hard. But like you said, if you widen that rep range and you're trying to go from your 12th to your 13th rep, that's great. But if you're staying in a very narrow, kind of moderately heavy rep range, you start to run into bottlenecks. And it's not that you're not providing a stimulus. I think you are, if you were just to hang out and, be able to move your 7RM a little faster next week. But I don't think psychologically that's something that most people can really hang their hat on, or even be aware of, that you moved your 7RM, 0.01 meters per second faster week to week. So it's useful to be able to go from your 14th rep to your 15th rep, or even your 15th to your 16th rep. Like you said, training in the 8 to 15 rep range, or if it's not, a compound movement, like the 10 to 20 rep range, I think is a great way to go.